So your webinar title again is Reconditioning the Injured Athlete, but principles over methods. And I wanted us to jump off the conversation with more of a general philosophical discussion on that concept. So, can you give a synopsis on this principles over methods concept, what that means to you, and why you think it's important?
Yeah, absolutely. I think nowadays in this era, especially with social media, there is an abundance of information that is readily available. And it's a lot of it is, I think, kind of saturated with things that have a decreased intent or a lot of complexity. And so, when we look at lack of intent, high complexity, it kind of detracts from our ability to make appropriate decisions and not really have a strong backbone, so to speak. And so, principles for me mean, well, what are the scientific or foundational or fundamental premises that we're abiding by that help us to kind of navigate through the noise, or what I like to say to curate the complexity, so to speak. And so, with that, we're able to make a little bit more of the ability to manipulate certain variables a little bit more strategically and understand to a better degree what outcomes we are trying to accomplish and what we have accomplished. Obviously, there's going to be a degree of uncertainty with any presentation. We can't know with 100% authority, but I think with having some type of a principle or blueprint in place, it allows you to become a little bit more repeatable in your process, or go back to the drawing board and say, hey, what did I do throughout this process that wasn't the most beneficial or suitable for that particular athlete or that particular patient. A good friend of mine and a coworker who's brilliant. He said, if you're trying to make a house, create a house, and you don't have a blueprint or you don't have principles, and you happen to somehow create the house, well, what's the chances that you're able to do it again? They're probably very, very low because you didn't have the principles or the blueprint. And the chances of succeeding the first time are also going to be pretty slim as well. But having those principles in place can help you make sure that you're streamlining things a little bit more and keeps you accountable as a practitioner.
Would you say also it's kind of a why versus how conversation? Like if we're going to use a different analogy, like a recipe, where you can memorize the recipe, but you don't have any flexibility if you want to experiment with a different ingredient or a different dose of a certain ingredient or something like that. You've only got that one way. And when that one way doesn't work, or you need to incorporate some flexibility within your method, you don't have that. But if you understand the principles of how the ingredients interact with each other, why your cooking time for some ingredients is longer or shorter than another, stuff like that. So you've got the principles, and now you can build in flexibility within your method. Is that somewhat of an accurate analogy?
Yes, definitely. It's I like that analogy a lot, and it's almost as if you don't have those principles, you become very myopic, so to speak, and you become very rigid in your attachments to certain methods. And so then you limit your adaptability to variable situations. Let's say, someone's a purist and again, all these methods I think can have a place in treatment, depending on the situation and the scenario. But someone might be a purist, FRC, and that's all they do, or SFMA, that's all they do, PRI, DNS, whatever method you want to use. But they can't stray away from that. Again, they become myopic. And so I think if you're able to understand, well, what are my principles? I can choose any particular method I like because it fits the scenario. And I can be a little bit more fluid or have some maneuverability throughout the process. It's almost as if you got a lot of tools or a lot of methods, but your organization is limited. So your toolbox itself isn't organized for all the tools that you have. So you never really know which one to pick and choose or plug and play with the individual or a specific presentation that you're presented with.
Yeah, you hear the "it's just another tool in my toolbox" analogy used quite a bit, and it's like, well, if it's the wrong tool, or if it, if it doesn't matter how many tools you got, or if you don't know how to use them,
I was gonna say
that's
just that. Yeah, you could have like the fanciest toolbox ever, but if you're just a crap handy person, like that's not it doesn't do you any good, really.
Yeah, exactly.
and you mentioned the blueprint analogy as well. Well, a blueprint is like a plan. It doesn't necessarily tell you how to build the structure, like the real nitty gritty, but that's maybe the if you understand the principles of constructing the plan, then you've got something going there, and again, you can be flexible. So no, I like to use these. I like talking through these analogies because I think it helps provide a framework. And with that, when we talk about reconditioning the injured athlete, or i.e. rehab, versus performance training, is it a versus performance training, or how do you see those two worlds blending together? Do you see them as very as the same? Are there differences where you're dichotomizing rehab and performance to some extent? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think they are very much one and the same with a few considerations. I mean, the biggest thing I think in regard to, rehab or reconditioning as opposed to specifically training is that I look at them almost as a continuum. And so there's going to be a little bit tighter parameters with the reconditioning or rehabbing specific individual. And that's going to be likely due to a higher or a lower, excuse me, tolerance. So they have higher sensitivity or irritability. And so we need a little bit more guardrails set in place to make sure that we don't overly exceed their tolerance or their capacity, because it's already lowered from the potential injury or tissue insult. And so, for them, how do we make sure that we're allocating the stress appropriately, and we're being a little bit more strategic? But again, that's a similar principle that you would have for someone that's just training without an injury. We're going to still be relatively specific and strategic about how we manipulate certain variables so that we don't increase or overtax them in regard to their envelope of function. We don't want to have this structural failure, and so I think the biggest thing is going to be manipulating those variables, but then also the mindset. That's going to be a huge thing. I think with your training, your mindset is a little different compared to when you're rehabbing. You're going to be a little bit more apprehensive potentially. And so we want to make sure that one of the principles is to cultivate this mindset or this optimism. And so I think we really need to harness that when we're dealing with an athlete that's injured as well, and really create this environment to where they feel less threatened. And if I feel or perceive less threat, that I'm likely to move a little bit more, have those movement options available for me to then be able to tolerate the appropriate amount of stress needed to try to induce a specific adaptation. And so, I try not to dichotomize them too much, but there is going to be this gradual escalating demand of stressors from the injured athlete, and then moving across the spectrum towards, okay, now we're training and we're really getting after it, and we're more so worried about output as opposed to worried about the input of the localized tissue with the injured athlete.